Hello, I am Professor Nirmala Menon, Professor of Literature and Digital Humanities at IIT Indore. In this segment, we will be talking about AI, Big Tech and the Internet. We have looked at some definitions of these terms in other segments. What we'll be looking at is the connections and the intersections between these three entities and what they mean for us as researchers in institutions and universities. Digitalization of society has led to a meteoric rise of large technology companies, what is called as big tech, such as Alphabet, Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta or Facebook, Microsoft, etc. The big five as they are called. Big tech's control of major digital platforms has allowed them to reshape communication, commerce and culture, and its dominance is expanding through their control of widely used generative AI models, and it amplifies their global influence. These firms own the core infrastructure of AI, including cloud services, for example, AWS, Amazon's cloud service, Azure, chips and proprietary data sets. What all of this means is that access to those data sets and access to that information gives big tech a big influence over how policies are shaped and how culture is changed across the world. We have seen a similar moment in the early 2000s, which Shiv Vishwanathan points out in his book Googleization of Everything, where Google looked at the possibility of digitizing every printed book that was produced. The whole massive project and the possible ramifications and consequences of a project like that was brought home to many governments, which led to regulatory frameworks of how those digitizations can be done, where would it be preserved, what would be the access of citizens and the public and the corporations and their access and the limitations of that framework. So similarly, we are at another transitionary moment with respect to AI, and as we all figure out how to navigate this, there are some realities or some constants that we need to be cognizant of while we move forward and frame policies and regulatory mechanisms that do not impede innovation but put steps on regulating how those services are used and deployed for societal impact. Similarly, as with generative AI, such as ChatGPT or DALL-E, is largely developed and deployed by big tech firms, intensifying their market reach and influence. Platform economies leverage network effects to grow monopolies, using real-time data to predict behavior, target users and expand into sectors like health, education and transport. And I think we have to pause and look at the massive ramifications of having access to, but more importantly, owning the data sets of these sectors that are so important and crucial to the well-being of citizens across the world, across countries. What can these data sets possibly be used for? They can be used for getting information, private information regarding citizens in any particular country. For example, health insurance. How does it impact health insurance for insurance companies to have data sets related to the health conditions of every individual citizen in a country? It's a big question, and we need to think of the consequences before we formulate policies that can regulate them. This is not to say that we should not use AI or that we should not have a private-public partnership to develop services and technology for citizen welfare, but societal impact has to be the benchmark for regulatory frameworks by governments across the world, while understanding that that may not necessarily always be the end goal for corporations and their interests and the stakeholders of those corporations. Generative AI and the implication of big tech influence. Consider this. Facebook currently has 2.3 billion monthly users. That is a third of the world's population. Google operates in close to 200 countries. Microsoft Office users are currently around 1.2 billion. Windows users 1.4 billion. Financial power of these big tech companies, big tech accounts for 22% of market capitalization of S&P 500 companies around the world. Some companies are larger than the GDP of some G7 countries like Canada or Italy. So all of these have to kind of influence the way in which we think about big tech and its influence on AI. Consider also that as of today, there are no standardized universal AI regulatory frameworks. In other words, what the big tech companies do and how they do it is often a blind spot for most governments around the world. Generative AI models such as ChatGPT-4, Claude, they are proprietary and they reinforce the centralization of technological power in the big five or in the big tech companies. It influences how AI is framed in media and policy discourse, often emphasizing economic benefits while downplaying ethical and societal risks. For example, if there is AI being used for search engines, right, what is the algorithmic codes behind search engines that determine what searches show up when we as an end user use those search engines? Right? And if the AI algorithms as well as the search engines are both owned by a single corporation, we can imagine what could be the possible consequences. Firms train generative AI on vast data sets collected through their platforms, giving them an irreplicable edge in model performance. It has a direct influence over AI governance by participating in advisory boards, drafting standards, and engaging in regulatory lobbying. Governments increasingly rely on big tech tools and infrastructure for their own AI adoption, reinforcing dependency and limiting independent regulation. Oftentimes, when governments need to use technology, they are dependent on these firms to help them deploy such technology for societal benefits. However, if the governments and the officials involved in these negotiations are not fully or completely aware of the hardware and the software behind these technologies, it becomes a little difficult to determine how the consequences of the frameworks after they are deployed. What you also see is that media and policy framing, when you use a search engine for certain terms, it kind of gives you the discourses. Those discourses then perpetuate, and more searches will lead to more kind of results, right? And in that kind of circle, there is a certain framing of a discourse that happens on the internet across very disparate geographies and locations. Now, how those communicate and intersect is still not visible to us as an ordinary viewer, but that data is still available to the big tech as a consolidated framework. And that really has ramifications for how AI is done. So as we look at the statistics and we look at the enormous influence of big tech companies and the deployment of AI and trying to understand what it might mean in the coming years, let us look at what is important for us. Right? What is AI influence, big tech influence over AI research? What you see is that the big tech influences the spread of ideas in AI research, in artificial intelligence research, using a mimetic framework. It analyzes over 160,000 AI related papers from S2ORC and OpenAlex databases, focusing on author affiliations and citation patterns. Big tech affiliated papers are more contagious for certain high impact memes, especially in data related security and niche ML applications. So if you see the figure, it gives you a consolidated picture of how AI research is consolidated and that data set is accessible to the big tech companies. I'll give you another example. Recently there was a news that one of the big publishing companies or the scholarly publishing companies had a deal with an OpenAI or ChatGPT to have access to millions of research papers that were published on their website or on their database. Right? Having access to that millions of papers allows a company or a big tech company like ChatGPT to train their data models, right, so that the writing of certain such generative papers by someone else would become far more accurate, quote unquote, and also more easier, right? And it is able to mimic the language of the millions of research papers that it already has in its data set. Right? These millions of research papers are technically the intellectual property of authors and researchers around the world, but they are used as data for training their bench models for generative AI. Right? How do you regulate that use of intellectual property of millions of researchers around the world? Right? How do you determine what are the lines of ethics and non-ethics in such a usage? Right? And how do we ensure that research continues to be objective and original when the source of originality becomes more and more blurred and more difficult to even determine? This is just one example of how data sets are being used in the area of education. We are also hearing that these data sets are now being, deals are being made with different publishing companies to have access to data sets of research papers across these companies. Right? And the deals that are being made are to the tune of 10 million to 100 million US dollars. The question here is not the amount of the money, the quantity or the quantification of the money. The question is that if a big tech company believes that it is a worthy investment to spend that amount for access to a data set, then it means that benefits from accessing that data sets and the possibility of monetizing the benefits of accessing the data set is possibly multiple times more than the amount that we are speaking of. Right? So, who determines how those amounts are used and where are they deployed, and what is the intellectual property right of the people who have actually developed those research and written those papers that disseminate that research to the public or the citizen and for their benefit. So this is just one example of big tech influence over AI research. There are multiple such examples. So this is just one of the ethical challenges. So if we were to think about ethical challenges in AI and big tech, there are some 5 or 6 areas that we can think about. One is laws of autonomy. This is true with the kind of example that I just gave you. AI automation undermines human decision making. And what happens when the current research methodology in AI that includes the human in the loop, and at what point is the human in the loop dispensable, and what are the consequences of dispensing with the human in the loop? Right? The question is that while we may use robotics for medicine or for surgery, what happens if the surgery does not have the doctor in the room? Right? Are we looking at such a future, and if we are, where is the assurance that the results will be the same, and who is accountable to who? And I think that's a big question. Bias and discrimination, that has been discussed before, but AI systems perpetuate social inequities in their training data, impacting hiring, policing and medical decisions. So, we have talked about a couple such examples, we have talked about it in other segments too, but representations, the diversity of data, collecting data that is easily accessible versus understanding what is the data that is necessary and going out and putting the resources to get that data are two very different things. And I think the role of research and universities and researchers is to follow the second point, and we are not quite sure that is probably the priority of big tech companies. Techlash and mistrust scandals, the Cambridge Analytics scandal that happened with respect to electoral results in the US elections a few years ago tells us the possibilities of using such data sets to influence electoral politics and democracies around the world. Algorithmic control of information flow can shape public opinion, elections and civic discourse. AI ethics as virtue marketing, and you have to look at those programs closely to see whether they are for purposes other than branding. Surveillance capitalism, data collection without consent raises privacy issues. As I mentioned in the beginning, these are issues related to healthcare, medicine, your private information, but it also in a democratic setup makes us question what it means for either big tech companies or governments to have complete transparent information about their citizens. What does it mean when we think about data as that makes us as citizens visible and transparent to both corporations as well as big governments, but does not make either those corporations or governments transparent to the citizen. So, data flow in many of these cases end up being a one-way traffic or not necessarily a two-way traffic, which is what it should be in a healthy democratic setup. And the final one is data colonialism, which especially for countries like ours is a very big question. Global South users often contribute data but lack access to AI benefits or decision making powers. So, we are home to almost a third or more of the human population, which means we are huge resources for data. What is the data being used for? How is it used for training models? What are the benefits of that data, and does the benefits of the data flow back to the demographics and the populations that you are accessing data from? Who is going to regulate that mechanism, and who is going to pin the accountability of that? So, to end, if we think about future directions for this relationship or the intersection of big tech, AI and the internet, I have like a few points. We need to understand that big tech is moving beyond platforms toward integrated ecosystems, and this combines artificial intelligence, clouds, hardware services, software, and it blurs the lines between internet infrastructure and intelligence. Generative AI is evolving into an interface for search, communication, productivity and creativity, reshaping how we experience the internet. Governments are developing AI specific legislation, for example the EU AI Act, with increasing calls for public control over algorithmic infrastructures. There is growing support for open source AI ecosystems, public infrastructure like a research cloud or open large language models or LLMs, and collective data governance. I think that cannot be emphasized enough, that a collective data governance is really going to be the predicate for an open democratic society in the days to come. The internet powered by AI is now seen as critical infrastructure. Its control and governance will shape geopolitical power in the 21st century. We need to be ahead of that. We need to understand, to navigate, and to put in regulatory frameworks that ensures that it safeguards both our democracy, our demography, and our polity.